Great. Well, thank you all for tuning in tonight. Chuck and I have a lot to talk about, and we're pretty excited about this. We've been trying to put this presentation together for over a year, and of course, you know, things got kind of derailed in 2020. But so we're really glad to be with you this evening. So tonight we're going to be talking with you about cotton weaving in both Mesoamerica and the northern U.S. Southwest. And this is a study of loom parts and weaving tools across 1,000 years and 2 continents. And there's a lot more there. So as we get started, before we get started, I want to go ahead and acknowledge the land of the ancestors through which we'll be talking about. So the artifacts and places that we'll be talking about today, or I guess this evening, are at or from the traditional homelands of many of the clans and groups of ancestral that are ancestral to the Hopi, the Zuni, Acoma, Laguna, and numerous Rio Grande River Pueblos, as well as clans of the Diné, also known as Navajo, and bands of Paiute, Ute, and Apache peoples in what now the Southwest. But we're also going to be talking about traditions of the Zapotec, the Mixtec, Triqui, Amuzgo, and other indigenous peoples in what is now Oaxaca, Mexico, and then some about folks in between. We're really grateful for all indigenous people who continue to maintain relationships with these and other ancestral landscapes, who fight for their protection, and who work towards preserving and protecting cultural traditions for future generations. So while the artifacts and materials and the sites that we're investigating for this research today are spectacular, they're also you know, collected from some of the most fragile and threatened places in the U.S. Southwest. So please, when you visit archaeological sites or other types of cultural sites around the world, remember to visit with respect and preserve and protect these places. As Paul said, I just got done with the U of A PhD program, and at the U of A, we're really into theory, right? So I'm going to start with a little bit of theory just to cover our butts and try to explain, you know, why we're talking about clothing. Why is clothing important to archaeology, to cultural anthropology? It's something I'm really passionate about, and that a lot of my research has been focused on, and it really obviously articulates what we're talking about this evening. So, you know, so clothing, why study clothing? Well, to start, it's really the most personal of the materials through which identities are expressed. You know, we can talk about who we are with our clothes. We can basically, you know, they're the key materials through which society is produced and reproduced. We can look at this in our everyday lives, and we can see this all over the place. The act of dressing is basically the practice and habits of dressing oneself, and it's a signifying system. And you can use dress to both passively and actively identify different aspects of your identities. And we can also then mask parts of our identities, or we can basically cover ourselves in these kind of social skins. And what we're going to be talking about this evening are some of the ways that people around throughout Mesoamerica and the Southwest really kind of subtly express shared identities. Sometimes they may not even been aware that they were expressing similar aspects of their identities over 2 millennia. Over 2 continents and over a millennia. So this is really important ways of thinking about, kind of framing about what we'll be talking about this evening. Now, of course, in much of the world, archaeological deposits are really rarely yield clothing or different types of perishable materials, because these materials basically biodegrade, they break down, they're eaten by bugs. And so we really have a really limited window into what types of clothing or how clothing is produced throughout much of the world. Of course, in the Southwest and then other parts of the world that have arid conditions or dry caves and alcoves like we do in the Northern Colorado Plateau, we have kind of a different situation where we get a lot clearer look at what people might have worn. But often we see things like this. We'll find little pieces of turkey feather cordage, so little yucca cordage with turkey quills wrapped around, and that's all we have. But really, you know, what this was a piece of this much larger thing. So we have this kind of limited view. So archaeologists, we have to be fairly inventive and imaginative and look for other types of material clues that will tell us what types of clothing people were wearing and how they were producing those clothes. And that's what we're looking at this evening. In particular, tonight we're going to be talking about cotton weaving. And the earliest evidence of cotton weaving comes from Mesoamerica, but then it may come from as far away as South America. There's some debate, and really, you know, in doing the background research for this and other studies, I was really surprised at how, you know, well, of course, you know, the further back you go, the more limited the evidence is. But I assumed that my Mesoamerican colleagues and South American colleagues had really nailed this down. But it seems like there's actually still a fair bit of debate whether cotton weaving, and especially weaving on looms, began in Mesoamerica, so especially southern Mexico, or if it was somewhere in the Andes of South America or somewhere in between. Now, again, like I said, a lot of the evidence for these technologies are obscured by time and decay. And so it's only in the places where we have either really incredible preservation or sometimes other types of media that show different types of textiles or how they're produced that we can really identify that those things were present. So it's a pretty interesting situation, and there's a lot more research that needs to be done. But there's, particularly with cotton weaving and with one of the earliest types of methods that people use to weave cotton on a backstrap loom in particular, it's really interesting how similar these are across this very large area. Basically, you can find the same types of weaving apparatus on these backstrap looms across this huge swath of land, from basically the southwest here up in the far north. And we have this little circle here where both Chuck and I kind of specialize in the Cedar Mesa area. But it's very similar to what we see in Mesoamerica and then also in South America. So, like I said, weaving originally, it seems like the earliest types of formal weaving of cotton really was on the backstrap loom, and this is something that's shared across this huge amount of this huge swath of land. Backstrap looms are also called belt looms, waist looms, even stick looms in some sources. And basically, one end of the loom is attached to a belt that grows around your waist, and the other is suspended from a tree or some kind of fixed point on the wall, or a wall loop, as we might see in some types of structures. And sometimes the far end is held by the feet with outstretched legs, or even on some type of secured bar just off the floor. And weaving proceeds upwards away from the weaver. Warp sets are controlled by heddles or shed rods, and the use of heddles and shed rods is really what differentiates true loom from just a fixed warp frame that was used to make other things like some of those turkey feathered blankets I just showed. And then sometimes a heddle is made out of a reed, but that was actually introduced, at least as far as we can tell, by the Spanish. And so these are kind of just some of the types of some of the variety, I should say, of belt looms or backstrap looms that we see in the ancient world. So on the left here, this is a depiction from Cape Pet Kent's view of a backstrap loom. And then on the right here, this is from Rodiger, and this is basically a very similar technology. This is a belt loom. This one actually looks like it's fixed to the floor and the ceiling, but really you can see the technology is nearly identical. And then on the bottom here is one of these backstrap looms that we identify, or that we were privileged to watch in action in Oaxaca in 2019. So the history of cotton weaving in Mesoamerica is somewhat well established, and so like I said, it's poorly understood in terms of the exact dates and times, but we do know we can push it back pretty far. So in the Mayan area, the earliest evidence that we have for backstrap loom weaving with cotton is from the Middle Formative period, basically about 1000 to 800 BC. And this earliest evidence of of weaving in Mesoamerica, and it's from cloth fragments, basically from the highland parts of I should say, the Mayan area, and then also from cloth fragments, or sorry, from cloth and garments depicted on stone monuments from La Venta. The archaeologists who work in this area have suggested that cloth at this time was already a prestige good. Now, among the classic Maya, it was woven cloth became even more of a prestige item. And in the classic Maya period, between about 250 and 900, it was likely woven by the Maya elite for local ceremonial consumption. It seems that weaving was a specialized skill of elite households, and they used it to affirm their noble standing. And the recovery of yarn production and weaving tools from high-status Mayan burials and tombs of both men and women shows that cloth production was likely not exclusively a gendered activity, among at least among the elites. And that seems like that was primarily where backstrap looms in particular and other types of cotton weaving were undertaken by the elites, and maybe in these kind of palaces or special settings. We also have evidence from the Veracruz lowlands from the terminal pre-classic, basically that runs from about 100 BC to 8300. And then also in the early classic period, where we see vigorous cotton spinning and weaving industries. And then, but still we see elite production of cotton yarns and textiles. And one of the earliest depictions we have of a backstrap loom in action comes from this, I'm going to say this wrong, Gianna figure, which is a classic period Maya depiction. Basically, it's a little ceramic effigy, and you can see this woman who's decked out in the regalia of nobility with these big ear spools, big gaudy necklace, interesting hairstyle, and this kind of exaggerated nose. And she is weaving on a backstrap loom. Now, in other parts of Mesoamerica, there's the evidence that we have for the backstrap loom is a little bit later in time. And but we have a lot of evidence of the use of cotton weaving on backstrap loom in the post-classic, and that runs from basically 900 to the Spanish conquest. And as opposed to in the Mayan area, in the Aztec area in particular, weaving on a backstrap loom and weaving cotton was highly gendered as a woman's activity. So Shangun reports that newborn baby girls were presented with symbols of womanhood, and the spinning whorl, the batten, the reed basket, which is for the unspun cotton, the spinning bowls, skeins, the shuttle, her little skirt, and her little blouse. And this was kind of a package that was given to newborn women, newborn girls, kind of to establish their gendered activity at a young age. And so along those lines, though, it was undertaken probably by elites and commoners alike, and that both elites and commoners used cotton cloth as a way to negotiate social status. Basically, in some senses, cloth was almost used as a type of currency or money. And cloth circulated in really wide circles as a commodity. Large quantities of cotton were often used as types of tribute, especially in the Aztec Empire. And here we can see a couple of really interesting depictions. So we see as an Aztec backstrap loom weaver as depicted by Sangun. And then in this lower picture, we see that a young man here, this married youth, is celebrating at his wedding party, and he's distributing cloth and food and smoking pipes that his wife over here on the right has produced. And this is from the Codex Mendoza. So you can see it's really, cotton was really important, and especially cotton cloth woven on a backstrap loom was a really important commodity, and in this throughout Mesoamerica early on. So in the Southwest, we don't see evidence of cotton production until much later. And so what we look for in the archaeological record comes in the form of, we have to kind of break this apart between cotton farming, or the production of cotton raw material, and then actual cotton weaving, right? Because just because you can weave some cotton doesn't mean you're growing it in your area. It might have been imported from somewhere else. And so what we look for is discarded cotton seeds, unspun cotton lint, which is what we call the little fuzz that comes off of the bowl, and you pull apart in card or gin and then make into yarns. Or we find plant parts. So for example, here's some ancient cotton bowls from Arizona State Museum that come from northeastern Arizona. But then evidence of actual cotton weaving comes in the form of cotton ginning tools, which Chuck will talk more about in a minute, or spindles and whorls for spinning the raw cotton lint into yarns. Weaving tools, of course, which we'll be talking about a whole bunch. Shanks and balls of yarn. You can see in the lower right here. This is another piece from ASM that actually comes from out of Chetro Kettle. This is a big, long, probably a disarticulated skein of cotton yarn. But then also sometimes we find yucca leaf-tip needles, other kind of less direct evidence comes in the form of loom anchors. So we find loom anchors sometimes implanted in the walls, the vertical wall surfaces of structures. And we think those are probably for, at least one of the things they could be used for was weaving with backstrap loom, securing the upper end of it. Or if we find loom anchors in the floor of a structure, as we see in the center picture here in the bottom slide, the bottom picture here in the center, those are for basically securing the base of the loom, the bottom loom bar to the floor, so you can have adequate tension to keep those the wefts really tight. And so when we find those in a structure, particularly in Kivas in the Southwest, we know that there was probably a loom present. Now, so and that's what we look for. But then from archaeological evidence, what we look for specifically for a backstrap loom, we look for shorter loom bars and shorter battens. And those are we'll be talking more about those in a second. Basically, those are the ways that you manipulate the warps and the wefts. And so shorter battens, around 8 inches long, we think are kind of ideally suited for either a belt loom or a small backstrap loom. The earliest evidence of backstrap loom weaving in the southern Southwest, Kate Peck Kent discussed probably the best evidence for that, excuse me, are narrow cotton textiles with warp float or warp-faced belting in the Hohokam area. And that's basically the result, the way the textile kind of comes to lay with the warps really being on the face as opposed to the wefts. And that's kind of the best evidence we have, because of course in the southern Southwest of the US, we don't have nearly the type of preservation that we do in the northern Southwest. There's many fewer alcoves and kind of these nice dry settings that don't get rained on. But in the northern Southwest, the earliest evidence of backstrap loom and really of cotton weaving, we think in general, comes from Antelope House, which is a cliff dwelling in Canyon de Chelly National Monument. It's actually in Canyon del Muerto, the canyon itself. And you can see these central pictures here in the slide, and then a plan view on the right. And it's a very large, technically, I guess it's not really a cliff dwelling, although it's the base of a cliff. And of course, this is its latest form, right? So the deposits where this earliest evidence of backstrap looming was produced come from Pueblo I context from about the 8800s, according to Pam Majors Lynn Teague. And in particular, there was a batten and a shed rod that were a bit shorter, especially the batten was shorter than 40 centimeters long. But then later evidence comes from Pueblo Vedino and Quetzal and other sites dating after about AD 1000. And some indirect evidence that we see for backstrap looms in particular are paired loops. There's some of those loom anchors, but set into the vertical wall surfaces of Kivas. And usually when we find them, and we think they're for backstrap looms, they're about 2 to 3 feet above the floor surface of these structures. And few of those in Mesa Verde National Park, and I've even seen some in the Cedar Mesa area. But here you can see, looking at Antelope House, the structure is in this upper right of this upper photo, but this area is really well watered and has it's really flat. This is floodplain in the bottom of the canyon, and of course sometimes this gets flash flooded, but really those are the conditions that cotton needs to produce. So it needs to be really, really warm and have a really long growing season, and then also to be have high temperatures, but then also a lot of water. And so we think that Antelope House in particular, or these settings like this in Canyon de Chelly or similar types of canyon settings, are really probably the ideal places where cotton could have been grown in ancient times. So there's later developments in cotton weaving after AD 1000. So I should say that, you know, between about 800 and 1100, there's really scant evidence for cotton production in the U.S. Southwest, especially in the northern Southwest. But we do think that it was probably practiced in great houses. And so there's rare items that are found in great houses were probably made by the occupants, and again used similarly in Mesoamerica, probably used in local ritual performances. And they're evidenced by the rare recovery of cotton textile fragments or even bone weaving tools. One example I have here shown is this twine sandal, and I looked at a bunch of these for my dissertation, and this is almost all of them except two, I should say, were made exclusively with yucca, but this one in particular had cotton wefts and yucca warps. So the internal structure was yucca, just like all the other twine sandals, but then the wefts are actually made of these three different colored dyed cotton yarns, and this thing's really thin. It's about as thin as your sock, and then it also has a square braided cotton cord that was used for the toe strap. Now this one has been repaired, but I've seen several others. There's actually a little bit more common where the toe straps or the heel straps were made of the square braided cotton, which would have been really probably a very prestigious type of thing. It's the most obvious thing you would probably see on somebody's foot when they're wearing one of these sandals. But so we think that probably cotton was used and cotton textiles were made on a really kind of rare basis. And really it's only in these great houses where we find any type of evidence. Well, I shouldn't say any type of evidence, but that's really the most common locations for those. Here at Crow Canyon, we've been analyzing some materials from the Wallace Great House, from the Haney Great House, and from a great house called Ida Jean right there in on this Lakeview community, these three great houses just outside of Cortez, Colorado. And one of the analysts on my team, Daniel Hampson, identified numerous bone weaving tools, basically modified bone awls, that we could see evidence of that they were probably used to weave between warps and wefts and pull those apart, kind of like a batten. And we think that's pretty good evidence for some type of manipulation of warps and wefts. After AD 1100, though, we see a really incredible development in the northern Southwest, and that's the development of the vertical loom. And we don't see that in Mesoamerica until very much later, several hundred years later, or I should say many hundreds of years later. And so the vertical loom is really important because it is a true US Southwest invention. And this is something that ancestral Pueblo people developed, of course, out of the backstrap loom technology, but by fixing the upper bar to the ceiling of a structure and the lower bar to the anchors in the floor, they were able to make a much wider loom and a much larger loom and produce much larger textiles. And so we have a couple examples here in the lower right of the slide. You can see a drawing from Cape Kent, and then on the left, you can see this is from Museum in Northern Arizona, and this is one of the only two full loom setups from the Pueblo III time period, basically after 1100, before 1300, that has been recovered intact in the Southwest, and they've basically overlaid these parts, loom parts, on top of this diagram. But that's really, really interesting. So there's been several recent studies of cotton weaving and of loom parts, primarily from the Cedar Mesa area. And these two projects include the Cedar Mesa Perishables Project and the Cedar Mesa Building Murals Project, and then also some twine sandal research that I did for my dissertation. But Cedar Mesa, before I turn over to Chuck, is in the Four Corners area. You can see it's in southeastern Utah, this little dark shaded area. If we zoom down here, we can see where Cedar Mesa is kind of in the larger culture defined regions. You know, of course, these are archaeological defined regions that may not fully reflect people's identities in the past. We can see basically the Cedar Mesa area is right between the Kayenta area and Glen Canyon, and then the Central Mesa area to the east. And so there's this kind of cross-pollination of all these different cultures. And then Cedar Mesa itself is dissected by numerous small canyons on the east and west, really bounded on the eastern side by Comb Ridge, on the southern side by San Juan River, and then in the Glen Canyon area is kind of a rough boundary to the west. All right, but then one last thing is, you know, this is also the area that we know now as, and especially recently, as the southern part of the Bears Ears National Monument. And so, you know, we get a lot of materials from this area, and there's a number of spectacular sites, thousands of them. But while the preservation of perishable materials and archaeological sites in this part of the Bears Ears in particular is greater and more frequent than other parts of the larger region, there's, you know, an increased threat from amplified visitation and historic looting, even recent looting and vandalism. So there's a really, you know, a very real need to document these resources, both archaeological sites and the materials that have either recently come from them or were excavated from these places in the past. And there's a very real need to document these before they're lost forever. Here we can see an example of a Kiva pilaster at one of these sites that I went to that had some evidence of weaving production, and somebody has basically scratched their name into the perfectly preserved surface of this pilaster. Another structure here in the center was a kiva that had been looted numerous times, and basically I went there in 2014 to kind of scout it out to do some documentation, came back the next year and it had been looted again, and actually did catch this person. Anyway, so now I will turn it over to Chuck.
My involvement with Ben and all of this came about when I became associated with Dr. Laurie Webster's Cedar Mesa Perishables project that Ben just introduced. For those of you who don't know, in the late 1890s, a number of early archaeological expeditions went into the Four Corners region with the purpose of amassing collections of these really remarkably preserved organic materials, cultural materials that these rich benefactors were wanting to, you know, build up these collections. Over time, these all ended up in museums scattered across the country, and Laurie Webster, you know, had realized that these had never really been published or documented. And so she set about a multi-year project beginning in 2011 to go through and document and get basic information and descriptions of all of this, you know, really remarkable material. She and I randomly crossed paths in 2011, which was the year she started her project. And I started, my initial involvement was to try to identify feathers. That's my main background, is birds. On this right-hand slide, you can see here's a classic example of some just beautifully preserved red-tailed hawk feathers. And you can see the conditions, you know, that these guys were working in. They weren't they weren't like today's archaeology. And you know, there were efforts. Richard Weather ended up being trained by guided by a trained archaeologist at the time. So we have pretty good provenience and information on some of his collections, not so much on some of the other ones. Okay, Ben, go ahead. These are the members of the project team. This is Lori in the upper left with Louis Garcia, a Pueblo weaver from New Mexico. On the upper right is Erin Garrity, textile expert. Erin works for the National Park Service. Lower left is Chris Lewis from Zuni, basket maker and weaver, and just a really great guy to have along. And this is yours truly on the lower right. Go ahead, Ben. So as we went through this, I was encountering, my involvement sort of evolved from just dealing with feathers to trying to identify the wood and some of the other raw materials these artifacts were made from. So as we go through these collections, we encountered numerous weaving implements. And this is these were thought by early archaeologists, they were called seed beaters. What they actually are probably ginning tools for removing the seeds from the cotton and fluffing up the cotton prior to spinning out the threads or the cords prior to weaving. And you can see the wonderful preservation that these things are. These things show. This is probably sumac wands involved in this one. Go ahead. Next slide, Ben. Here's a series of weaving-related implements, spindles and whorls that we came across. The upper one here is a complete spindle with a little bit of cotton thread left, with a cottonwood disc whorl on it. Upper right is if you could see this in person, it's just spectacular. It's this beautifully worked stick of greasewood with the spindle whorl made of bighorn sheep horn. Same here on lower right, which is a photograph that Ben took. And lower left, these two photos are spindle whorls made of cottonwood root. You know, and you know, I'm not a weaver, but you know, these are fairly lightweight, and I'm sure that has something to do with controlling or spinning. You know, you're spinning getting your threads to spin out properly. Louis Garcia would probably be, and Chris could probably speak to exactly how the mass of these spindle whorls function. Okay, next slide. We came across a number of battens. Now up here on the plateau where these came from, it's kind of easy to make a lot of these identifications because it's not an overly biodiverse region. There's just a handful of trees that are suitable for this, and a lot of these woods can just be macroscopically easy to identify. Oak has some characteristics that make it particularly easy to identify, and you can see that on the left are some modern Pueblo battens, and you can see if you look really close, particularly on this bottom one, and again on this one along this top edge, you can see these indentations or striations from the warp cords from just, you know, hours and hours and hours of use. And you can see this continuity from prehistoric, you know, 1200s on the left to modern 20th century, on the right to modern 20th century on the left. Go ahead, Ben. Now, just to give listeners when I was working with Lori, we're going through this and we're encountering all kinds of artifacts, not just weaving implements. And this group of 3 items up here on the upper left were really puzzling. I'd never seen anything like them. The original collectors had them labeled as bows with a question mark. And Lori mentioned that, well, you know, possibly they may be weaving temples. Well, we were able to get back to New York with Chris and Louis, and he took one look and said, yeah, those are temples. They're a tool to help keep the textile squared up and with a straight, even edge. And there's modern, you see this exact same technology and tool used in modern weavers, as well as in these, you know, 800-year-old loom components. So I thought that was kind of neat. I'm not real sure what materials these were used for. They're not in real great shape. They may be cottonwood or willow. And again, Louis and Chris might be able to speak to exactly what those were made from. Okay, next slide. Okay, Kim.
So thanks, Chuck. Yeah, so that's a really exciting project, the Cedar Mesa Perishables project. So at the same time as they were doing that, for my dissertation work, one of the main things I was doing was I set up a project called the Cedar Mesa Building Murals Project, all on Cedar Mesa. I was kind of looking at weaving from the other side, from more the field side. So Chuck and Lori and their team were looking at old museum collections. I was looking at old sites that had been either looted or sometimes just really well preserved, where we could see similar evidence. So the goal of my project was to basically create baseline documentation of archaeological resources, especially fragile archaeological resources in the Cedar Mesa area. And primarily I was trying to help federal land managers at the BLM establish management plans and to preserve archaeological sites who are at risk. And then also goal was to help descendant communities establish and kind of reinvigorate their ties with ancestral landscapes. But really the goal was to document, the primary goal was to document different mural styles that were in these structures and look at how they changed over time. So here you can see in this picture, there's myself and one of my volunteer crew members who are great, documenting this intact Kiva, or at least mostly intact Kiva, and then it has this one in particular has this really nice mural around the banquette here. And then we were taking tree ring samples out of some of the logs in some of these roofs. That was going to help us date the structures, then also to develop regional chronologies and paleoclimatic reconstructions. And then through presentations like this, we hope to help foster preservation ethics amongst the general public. And of course, last but not least, it was designed to help me with my PhD research. And this project was initially funded by the Canyonlands Natural History Association, the Tree Ring Lab, and the National Science Foundation. And the goals of the project, or at least the methods of the project, are really light on impact. So we went to these really fragile sites, but we basically did judgmental surveys, talked to local landowners and local archaeologists and enthusiasts to see, where some sites were that might have different types of plaster decorations or murals. And we went to these sites and we photographed them, we mapped them, and did in-field artifact tallies. We even did some photogrammetry or 3D mapping in some places. And then also, like I said, took some tree ring core samples out of some of the roofs to try to date the structures so that we can infer when these different styles of murals were created. And this occurred between 2013 and 2017. I had a great group of volunteers that helped me out, over 45 volunteers, a number of University of Arizona anthropology students and other archaeologists and advocates from throughout the Southwest. We visited a number of sites. We documented or mapped 28 different structures at 16 sites and found 110 new murals at other sites throughout this Cedar Mesa area. Took a bunch of tree ring samples, and about a third of those samples dated, which is actually just on par for the average of tree ring dating. These are some of the types of maps we drew at these sites. Some of these sites have been documented back in the 60s and 70s, but really needed the site maps and the documentation needed updating. So this is just one section of this big site here. You can see that both of these pictures are from there. And then this is one of my volunteers again in the upper picture, helping to document this nice long hallway. And in the lower right, my friend Jonathan Walker, and then Erin Garrity, who you saw in an earlier picture, who works for the Park Service. She was out helping us as well while she was working on her master's degree. Then back in the tree ring lab, basically I compiled all the data and basically cross-dated these samples and see if we could date the structures where the different types of murals came out of. And it worked out just incredibly well. If you look at this distribution here from 1100 to 1300, this timeline, basically you have these different styles of murals that were made within pretty tight date ranges. So earlier on, we have this encircling white band style at a couple structures. And these, of course, it's limited by the structures that were built in the in the canyons where the preservation would allow murals to remain intact, and the woods as well. Then we also had incised murals that were made from 1200 to 1250. And then the new style of murals came out about 1250 and was used until this area was depopulated. And these are some of the types of murals that we found. And as you can see in the upper right here with this really nice interlocking step fret, it's actually a textile design. And then we also had depictions of incised depictions of sandals. And then scribe depictions of sandals. So we're kind of looking at textiles from the kind of the other end of this, so depictions of them. But inside some of these structures, we know that people were weaving. So this is a cross section of a kiva that I drew here that we worked at. And you see in the floor, there's these loom anchors. And like I said, these are to secure a loom between the floor and the roof. Probably not a backstrap loom in this case. But there's depictions of loom woven textiles. So here we can see in the upper frame here, this is probably one or maybe even two different cotton belts. They were woven cotton belts that show some really unique, kind of hard to recognize, low visibility, we call it, attributes that define, that show that whoever made this depiction was probably pretty familiar with how these textiles were made. They also had a bunch of these sandal depictions. And this is just one of a number of different structures that had similar types of designs. So again, you can see here this big cotton belt, probably a small image, kind of an annotated version, if you will, of a cotton blanket with these interlocking step frets or step triangle designs. And this one had like 25 different depictions of sandals. And then over here on the right, this is a little out of scale, not to scale, but there's a lot of depictions also we think are probably woven tump bands. And so these are just some of the structures here that have painted murals. And you can see these two on the lower left here are depictions of, they're painted murals, but the imagery instilled in them is of cotton textile based designs. And so we do have cotton textiles themselves that have similar designs. So even though these aren't textiles themselves, they are very are based on woven cotton designs. But then also in these structures, like I said, because they're probably weaving in a number of these places, and maybe they're even using these depictions, especially the really highly ornate and really intricate ones, as maybe mnemonic devices or teaching tools that help teach people how to weave, new generations how to weave. We also found a lot of weaving tools. So here we have the yucca leaf tip needle. And of course, yucca is really fibrous, and you rip off the needle in this case, and you have some fiber come out the end, and then they actually splice this with a piece of cotton string. And this would be for either finishing a textile or maybe repairing one. We also found a couple examples of these small weaving battens, or maybe it's a shed rod, and that probably is for a backstrap loom. There's another on the lower left, not very well preserved, but you take what you get. And this is a weaving batten fragment, kind of similar to what Chuck showed you earlier, but not in quite as good condition. And of course, it's broken on the left here. And then loom anchors. So like I was saying, those are really strong indicators of that some type of loom was being used in these structures. Although if they're in the floor, it's usually most likely one of the vertical looms. And then these wooden awls, and these are really interesting because they're not very well documented throughout the Southwest, but the more I look, the more of them I come across in both museum collections and just in archaeological sites. So I was very interested to see what those what those might have been used for. And so with both Chuck and I, we had some great experiences documenting weaving tools and apparatus and imagery from different points of view. And we worked with some great folks, but then, really there's some things you can't really quite explain unless you talk to the experts. And so we were both fortunate enough to be invited on this traditional technology seminar in Oaxaca, Mexico for between March 8th to 17th in 2019. And this was sponsored and supported by the Arizona Archaeological and Historical Society. So we're really grateful for you guys for also, helping us go on this trip and then having us here to talk about it. So here on the left, you can see the team that went down. So there was about, 12 of us or something. And we have a group of, it's archaeologists and videographers, and then Pueblo weavers. Chuck is, wildlife biologist, but of course has a keen interest and specialty in documenting weaving tools and other types of perishable materials. And then we met up with Eric Mindling here, who ran Traditions Oaxaca, which was basically kind of like a tour service, but it's more than that because Eric is incredibly fluent, totally fluent in Spanish, and he basically lived in Oaxaca for at least, I don't know, was it 20, 30 years, something like that. And he knows the ins and outs of the country and of Oaxaca itself, and then knows all these people. So basically what we did is we all flew down to Oaxaca, got in this bus, and went and toured around and talked to indigenous weavers. So we brought Pueblo weavers. We have Mary Oaxaca is our weaver. She is Comanche, and oh gosh, of course now I want to say Isleta, but that's probably wrong. I'm sorry. And then Louis Garcia, incredible weaver. Akeem Homayumtewa, I believe how you say it. I'm so bad at pronouncing Hopi words, I'm sorry. And then Chris Lewis, that's a little bit easier. But these guys are just incredible weavers. And so they really, they were not just going down to learn about weaving, but then also to talk to weavers and to try to get some type of exchanges going. And it was just a really great experience. So this is basically what we kind of did is we went to these different weaving collectives. This particular one was a group of mixed tech women, and then they would tell us about weaving different aspects, either the technology, the process, even the ideological use of different types of depictions, different types of symbology and symmetry and things like that in their textiles. It was just amazing. We went down and shared knowledge, and so it wasn't just us listening to the weavers, especially the Pueblo weavers were really talking with these folks and just really excited and coming like, oh, this is how you do this. This is how you do a brocade. This is how you do this, this twill tapestry weave. This is how you do that. And they were just really excited. It's like, oh, I've seen that, but I didn't know how they did it. And those types of interactions, it was just amazing. And then we got to see all different processes of production. So our assistant guide here, Charlie, was talking to one of the cotton producers that lived at the Santa Maria Zacatepec Weaving Collective, which was again a mixed tech collective. And then this other weaver here, we got to watch her spin cotton yarn on a spindle whorl, this supported spindle in Coahuila, and it was just amazing to basically see these technologies in action. So our fearless leader, of course, Shelby and Kelly Hayes Gilpin and Lori Webster were kind of in charge, but Lori really she really mapped out where we're going. And of course, she was on my dissertation committee, so I did, basically anything she says was written in stone for me. But this is what we did. So we kind of basically, she outlined for us. We really started at the center of Oaxaca, and then went up to the northwest, and then down south across the through the coast, and ended up in the Huatulco area. And so really got to see a huge part of Oaxaca. And if you've never been to Oaxaca, you should go. It's my favorite part of Mexico. It's got highlands, it's got mountains, deserts, rainforests, and then of course beaches, incredible beaches, and just kind of everything, all the different types of environments you might want to go check out, full of indigenous people and great culture and great food, and all within about a day and a half drive. So it's just amazing. We, of course, took over a week to do this, but one could go through this area much more quickly. But if you go, I definitely recommend taking your time. But we got to do a bunch of different types of demonstrations and hands-on activities. So here you can see a good part of the group, including Chuck here at the front, learning how to, right now what they're doing is basically taking the seeds out of this brown cotton, and as we watch a Backstrap loom demonstration. We had, I think, at least 10 different demonstrations throughout the week, so it was just amazing. But we got to talk to both our Zapotec folks, Mixtec folks, some Triqui folks, which is a language isolate, I'm told, some folks that also speak in the Musgo language, which is also a language isolate, and really kind of see how weaving varied across just Oaxaca all in one time. It was amazing. Right, so I'm going to turn it back over to Chuck to talk about some of the highlights that he encountered.
You know, Ben's been talking about, watching the various people spin the cotton. Well, this whole experience made my head spin. There was just so much. And as a biologist, and particularly a biologist, spent most of my time on the Colorado Plateau, which has a limited biodiversity in many ways, fairly simplistic plant communities. I went down here and was just absolutely blown away. I mentioned earlier, we have a handful of plants, woody plants that could be used for, say, making a batten. Down here, I just would look around and just I didn't know what trees I was looking at, but I could tell I was looking at many, many different kinds of trees. So, when I came back, I just started looking into Oaxaca, comparing Oaxaca, the biodiversity of Oaxaca with Arizona. And, and I jotted down some notes. So for example, I'm a bird guy. Bear in mind that Oaxaca is 1/3 the size of Arizona. I went to iNaturalist. The bird list on iNaturalist for birds in Arizona is 524 species, and almost 760 for Oaxaca. And this increase in biodiversity from Arizona to Oaxaca actually begins in central Arizona at the Mogollon Rim. So you go south, 135 reptiles versus 284 reptiles, amphibians, 29 up to 152 species of amphibians, mammals, 159 to 254. And then plants is what really, really jumped out. Arizona has approximately 3,400 species of plants. Oaxaca has a plant list of over 10,000 species. So you realize there was a lot of raw evolution for human beings in this region to experiment and come up with things. And so the biodiversity really jumped out at me. And I sort of feel like human cultures and even maybe the human mind is deeply affected by the natural world around us. I mean, we are part of that. Go ahead, Ben, next slide. So I thought, okay, it would be kind of interesting to see what kind of materials they used. And on the left is a photograph of Ben's notebook. We laughed because we were trying to find some photos today, and he mentioned his notebook. I said, I've got a photo of your notebook of this same drawing. And the people, we had no way of really figuring out what plants they might have used for a heddle or for a batten. It may be they just had so many options. They used, maybe one region was traditional. Up north, we don't have to worry about it. Most of the battens in the northern Southwest are oak. So you can see the challenge of having a diverse area and trying to do some simple identifications. On the right This guy was great. He would make these wonderful little spindles out of mangrove root. And you can see, he's using this great big machete, and he's sitting there barefoot and just works and whittles it down, and made these wonderful little spindles that you see completed on the lower right. Here's a painted one and an unfinished one. So you see a modern tool, a large machete being used to make this really wonderful, delicate little spinner, this little spindle from which to make these really fine cotton threads. So go ahead, Ben. Okay.
All right. So yeah, and I just have to add with Chuck's discussion of the spindles, it was just this is the guy. Basically, there's right now, because of a lot of different factors, there's not very many people in Oaxaca that makes these spindles. And so this man, he'd been making these spindles. He was known across the state for making them, and people would come from miles and miles and miles to get these spindles, spindle whorls. Basically, he carved the spindles himself, like Chuck said, and then his wife made the little clay whorls, and they actually fired them in their wood stove that we also saw, and they would put them together, and then she painted them. And we saw it looked like there were probably 2 different producers of these across the state that everybody wanted. And so for whatever reason, and there's a lot of reasons that we could talk about, but they were the specialists. But yeah, so I had, there were some great things related to that coming out of it, like the spinning, as Chuck was talking about, that really caught my eye. And of course, I'd seen studying textiles from books and museum collections. Basically, had seen these different depictions of people using these supported spindles, and basically you can see it just matches up with this lady here on the right from. They were from San Juan, Colorado is the name of the town. So, living up on the San Juan in Colorado, or near the San Juan in the Colorado, I was right at home, and it was great. But yeah, so you could see basically, again, this technology in action, and these people were just having a great time. And you can see these ladies are laughing because at least in a lot of the parts of Oaxaca we went to, cotton spinning and even cotton weaving was primarily a gendered women's domain type of activity. And like I said, not everywhere, but so I sat down and I've spun cotton, I spin yucca, a bunch of things, dog hair, buffalo hair. I'm pretty good at spinning. I don't really weave much yet, but that's the next step. But so I sat down and wanted to try this out. And these ladies were just rolling. Not only was I the biggest, whitest guy they've ever seen in their life, but I actually pulled it off a little bit. I wouldn't say I was the best spinner, but they were just laughing. It was so much fun. And so, and that was really, for me, that's one of the ways to learn this technology, and to learn this is, not just by reading books, not just by trying out myself, but also, getting these folks to show me how. And that was, one of the great things about having our guide Eric, who is totally fluent in Spanish. My Spanish is really broken, but having him there was that he could translate. But of course, then these ladies, Spanish was not their first language. Mixtec was actually their first language. So they would talk to one of the younger ladies who spoke Spanish fluently, and then that would get translated to Eric, and then Eric would speak English, and it would, around like that. So. But in spite of all that, we had a whole lot of fun and learned a lot about spinning. And when I go back, you can see this beautiful natural brown colored cotton. If I go back to Chuck's thing, you can see at this particular place, they had 4 different colors of naturally occurring cotton. So dark brown, light green, and white, which was just amazing. But then, being an archaeologist, and like I said, I've seen these loom parts in the U.S. Southwest from the sites I've been working at. So I was really interested in trying to identify these things because, for the most part, in the Southwest, in the sites I looked at, unless you see the worked ends of these loom pieces, so the loom bars or the heddle sticks, basically they're just sticks. they just look like, kind of semi-polished sticks, unless you can see some use wear from, like Chuck pointed out on those battens from being used to pound down the warps between, or sorry, the wefts between the warps. Or if you can get the ends. And so I was really interested in looking at the ends of these backstrap loom setups. And so you can see a couple pictures here of just these really intricately worked, in some cases, in diverse different tool sets. And then where we could, because kind of one of the assignments Chuck and I had, our part as archaeologists and stuff, we didn't know enough to talk to the weavers about their technique, but we were trying to identify different types of tools. Are the tools the same in between these two different parts of the world? Are they different? Do they have similar names maybe? And so I was really excited when I found this diagram from Coquila, from that weaving collective, where they actually had both the Spanish, they call it Castellano, and then the Mixtec local names for all these different weaving parts. And that was just really, really fascinating to see. But that really helped, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then one of the coolest parts also, other than just seeing these things and seeing the incredible countryside and all the great experience, was to listen to the discussions between the Pueblo weavers and the Oaxacan weavers, and not just weavers, but just the folks that we encountered. So we had a great discussion up here about in Coquila about just some of the challenges that these women face, basically for decades and maybe even longer than that, because of the way the Mexican economy is set up. Men in their villages had kind of the mobility to basically don other clothes, put on the kind of working man's clothes, and go out and do labor in other places and bring back money to help support their families. But because of different economic situations and political situations, women really didn't leave the villages much, and so their ability to bring in an income to help support their family was limited. And so one of the ways they've gone about that to get past that recently is to form these weaving collectives. And so with the burgeoning of the tourist industry, especially tourists that are interested in these kind of higher quality textiles, they found a market where these women will actually go and they'll take their goods, and they'll be able to take them either to larger markets in other villages, where they can interact with tourists and sell them there, or through other means. And it was really interesting to kind of hear how these women are finding ways to, they have the agency to improve their situation. It was really interesting to see. And then these ladies here that we were talking to, they're actually not weavers, but they make metates. And at the Tlacuda market, which is this incredible market, there's markets all over, but incredible experience. And so you can see here, Chris, Lori, Kelly, and I with Eric, and he was translating for us again. And some of these ladies spoke Spanish, and they were so excited because they consider themselves Pueblos too, right? They live in Pueblos, and that's how they see themselves, as Pueblo people, although it's probably a slightly different definition than we use in the Southwest. But they were so excited to hear that Chris was Zuni, and he was a Pueblo person. And they were exchanging stories about this communal performance or event at Zuni, where they had all these matates lined up in a row, and these dances and songs and stuff happened because of it. And these little ladies, and the size actually is right there, are very short, but they were so excited that there were Pueblos that still were occupied and lived in the U.S., but that those folks and us also were interested enough to come and talk to them, and that we were interested in their lives and the way they did things. And that was just, they were so excited, and it was just so cool to kind of hear that. And then down in the lower left here, you can see Akima, he's Hopi, and he is also an incredible weaver, has won a number of awards, really great guy. And he is just fascinated with this lady at Pino Tepe, Don Luis, who's making this pashuanca, which is this special kind of skirt that really only comes from this area, at least today, and is traded all over the place. And they use these special kind of dyed yarns. And she has all these different, I think these are shed rods. And she was using pieces that are basically bicycles, wheel, not struts, spokes, and you know, use whatever you can. And she was making these incredibly intricate designs, and he was just like through the roof, just like, wow. And it was so cool to see that interaction and see that exchange of knowledge. It was just priceless. So Chuck, I just, you know, I switched some things around, so I'll go with this and I'll turn it back over to you. But so, you know, part of the reason that we were invited to go on this trip, Chuck and I and the other archaeologists, is to kind of help to frame how we see and interpret the archaeological record in the Southwest. And so it wasn't just a vacation, even though it was also that. But so for my part, I was, like I said, really interested in these loom parts. And so I was trying to figure out, you know, is there a difference between, so backstrap loom tools versus the upright loom that we might see in the Southwest, or you know, differences between backstrap technologies in the U.S. Southwest and Oaxaca. And so I started to try to see, you know, what might be missing from what we think is a normal archaeological assemblage of weaving tools from the U.S. Southwest. And it's kind of hidden in here in plain sight if you look real hard. So one, you can see that we have heddles and shed rods and loom bars and battens and all these different things. But one of the things that we see right here is really key. And this lady's using this pick, this weaving pick. This was actually a broken spindle whorl, or the shaft of a spindle whorl. But one thing that we didn't see were combs. No combs. This is from the Arizona State Museum. This is from the ancient example from the Southwest. But I looked through all my pictures over and over and over again of all these different places. We went to these different backstrap weaving collectives and probably talked to at least, you know, saw at least 30 different weavers. We didn't see a single comb. Other than one that a guy used on this Spanish loom, like later introduction. And so that was really interesting. So here you can see the full setup of this woman's backstrap loom setup from I think it's Santa Maria Zapotec, and not a comb to be found. And basically, so in place of, or I should say not in place, but instead of, because, you know, this is an earlier invention, they use those picks. And I thought that was just really, really fascinating. So what that suggests, and of course, you know, where I'm trying to follow this up with my own research, is it suggests that a weaving comb might actually have been developed specifically for use on that northern Southwest invention, the upright loom. So you're the first folks to hear that now. So fasten your seatbelts, because it's going to be neat. So then taking that home, then, you know, bringing it back to these tools I just showed you, you know, again, not a single weaving comb. And that doesn't mean they don't exist. There are a few scattered examples in the archaeological record in the northern Southwest, but they seem, at least so far, to be connected with those vertical upright looms, those later versions. And so instead of those combs, where it looks like people are probably using these wooden awls, and some of them actually do show similar types of wear that you might see for basically tamping down. If I go back real quick, tamping down like this lady here is doing those newly added weft rows. So I was really excited about that. Now I'll turn it back over to Chuck for the conclusion.
So as I mentioned earlier, you know, I think if you look at the map on the right, I've said for years as a biologist that Mexico ends at the Mogollon Rim in central Arizona. You know, as a birder, you know, you see that a lot, especially with birds. But what happens is culturally, you know, what I took from this trip is that the southwestern United States is really a part of Mesoamerica. the Pueblo villages, the traditional technologies, the farming, the corn, the beans, the squash, the cotton, macaws, all of this came from the South. At the Hopi basket dance a few years ago, the Hopi lady said, well, you know, the strong oral tradition is that the basket dance came from the South. So you have this coming up into the Four Corners region where Ben and I live. It's really the last culturally of the last of Mesoamerica coming up from the South. Even the rains, even the monsoon comes up from the South. But what happens is so much of biologically stops at the Mogollon Rim, but through human ingenuity, human adaptability, and uses of technology, the culturally Mesoamerica is able to extend further north beyond where a lot of the biology tends to hold back. And I thought that was really wonderful. I'll never look at the Four Corners region and these the native Puebloan cultures of this region the same, it's just all tied to the South. You know, and I don't know, I just think that's pretty wonderful stuff to have that, and where you see so many different things. So that's sort of my big take home. You know, Ben was able to look at the real fine points and really tease apart it on a fine level. So much of that overwhelmed me. I had to step back and look at, okay, what is the bigger pattern that I can absorb and see here? So go ahead, Ben.
Well, yeah, so that pretty much wraps it up, other than just a couple of great shots of, you know, it wasn't all just work and research, even though that was a big part of it. We did get to have a lot of fun. And you know, I didn't know very many of these people to start with. And so it was, you know, after over a week of tooling around in a little bus through windy roads and on boats and soaking in the water, we, you know, really got to form some great relationships that we've actually also been, you know, continuing with our own work. I know Mary and I have talked about doing some work. Chris Lewis and I have done some projects. I've been talking with Louis a bunch. I know Chuck as well has been working with all these folks. John Douglas, Curly. Oh gosh, he has not a lot of name. Anyway, Curly is doing the video for us, and I don't want to butcher his last name. But anyway, so we really did form some great relationships, and we hope to continue those in the future. And I think sometime in the next year, we're going to try to all get together and do maybe some type of group presentation, is what Lori just told me about recently. And so we hope that you all tune in for that. And so, you know, we just want to say thanks again to the Arizona Arc and His in particular for helping sponsor this trip, but then for all of the different sponsors that have and folks that have helped us throughout our other research to get to this point. So with that, we're going to go ahead and we can stop our share and open it up to questions, if there are any. Fran, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. So that was awesome. What an exciting project. And to hear both of your perspectives was just awesome. Let me just say that the Traditional Technologies Project is going to present to one of our monthly lectures in November of this year. So that one will definitely be through Zoom, because people will be presenting from all over in that presentation. So we're excited about that. All right, we do have quite a few questions. I'm going to start with one that was asked a few times. The loom anchors, what are they made of? Are they made of ceramic? I've got a few different ways that question was asked.
Yeah. So let's see. I could, if you let me share again here, if I can go back to that. Sure. Let me show you the picture. So loom anchors. So there's like 5 or 6 ways that they're made. Let's see. No, I went past it. Sorry. Right. See a couple pictures right there. So here's three different depictions of loom anchors in the center lower picture. The most common are where people dug a hole down into the floor of a structure, and then they had a loop of either what looks like to me either willow or maybe even oak that was bent, and then it was kind of bent over here, and then they'd add juniper bark or some other types of leafy materials. Often there's a corn cob in there in that kind of bundle, and then it's bound together and it's stuffed into this hole that's dug in the floor, and then it's sealed up around the edges. And that's a really, really common type. There's other types that are toggles like this, so where you have a stick that's basically you dig a hole that's slightly has these kind of ends to it, and you put a little toggle in there, if you will, and it has a string coming up. The string protrudes out of the floor, and they'll plaster around that, so just the strings coming out, and that'll be the bottom to the loop that secures the loom. And then I actually came across one example where they used a long stick that was actually about 2.5 meters long, buried that in a little trench in the floor, and then again had these little strings periodically protruding from the floor. They'd plaster around them, and then they could use to anchor the loom. Occasionally you'll see some, if they have a bedrock surface in the bottom of a structure, they actually have these little biconical holes that drill down into the sandstone and make a little loop there, although that's less common. And there's several other ways, but those are really kind of the most common 4 types of loom anchors that I saw.
Cool. Also, in what kind of cotton, what species of cotton were found in these regions? You showed some different colors and that sort of thing, but can you talk about the species?
Chuck, do you know how to short answer that one?
Well, I think it was just a single species as far as I know, but it had those color variations to it. There's that greenish and the whitish, and then the brownish cottons. I'm not a cotton expert. I want to say I don't know if the cottons from South America were the same species or not as the stuff that was grown in Mexico and further up in the United States. And then there's Egyptian cotton. I think that may be different. I think what American cotton was, New World cotton is an annual, and possibly the Egyptian cotton was perennial. I'm not sure about that.
Right. Well, and of course, my oh gosh, it's on the tip of my tongue. But there were a couple that we did see one different species at least. Let me see if I can flip to that, and that was where is it for Chuck? I left it there. No, back.
The tree cotton.
Tree cotton that we saw. You can see on the upper left here. And we saw 2 different examples of this, and I'm not exactly sure on the species of that, but I was reading about it, and it's actually a different species, and it grows on these big trees. Ooh, I'm screwing that up there. Hold on a sec. But basically, it has the same type of bowl. I'm losing my cursor. Same type of bowl here. But this actually grows, and it's not growing in a single season. And so that one is different. And I know it was used fairly similarly is what I was been reading about, but I'm not exactly sure on the species name for that one. But then like Chuck was saying, these different colors are actually, that you see in the lower left here, are the same species. They're just a slightly different variety. But they do intentionally keep them distinct because there is a lot of social value to be able to have these different varieties. And that was one thing that was brought up by these weaving collectives, is that, they almost lost these different varieties. And so there was a really big push in the last 20 years or so to find examples of these different colors, because basically when the Industrial Revolution came in and through a bunch of different social processes, basically synthetic yarns and synthetic dyes came in and kind of replaced these natural colors. But now, because of the resurgence of this kind of tourist driven kind of sales in particular, and also a revitalization of indigenous rights and indigenous identities, they've really started to try to strengthen the distribution of these varieties. And so that was something that was really interesting to hear.
Okay. Do you have any insight into how and when people first learned how to grow, process, and weave cotton fiber? Was cotton native to these regions, or did people obtain cotton seed through trade?
So that's a great question, and that's a really tricky one. So like I said at the beginning, there's some debate whether cotton and then the backstrap loom itself, but it's cotton in particular, was domesticated in Mesoamerica or in the Andes or other parts of South America. And really, like I was saying, unless we have the preservation that we just don't know. So we don't know if people were producing or trading quite often. So what we look for in the archaeological context are seeds or bowls or plant parts, or even just discarded cotton pieces, kind of showing that there's a lot being produced, a lot of cotton being worked with, and so there's a lot of discard. And in those instances, then we assume that cotton was being grown in the local area for production. But we know that especially there's a great case in the Southwest, those what we know is those dog hair sashes from the Bassmaker III period from Obelisk Cave. Lori Webster did some research not too long ago, I think with Karen Adams, and they actually figured out that some of that dog hair in those sashes wasn't just dog hair, it was actually some cotton as well. And so, but that's kind of this early kind of isolated example, and they AMS dated it to, I believe, the late Bassmaker III period. And so in those instances, we assume, because we don't have any evidence of the actual plant parts, right, that cotton might have been traded from somewhere else. And so that's, the kind of thing that kind of hamstrings us a lot of times as archaeologists, is just that we don't have the preservation to be able to make those links. So it's tricky to say, but like I said, where we do find that kind of suite of evidence, that does suggest that people are growing cotton as opposed to just importing it from outside. But in particular, like the coast of Veracruz, the Gulf Coast of Mexico, the kind of lowland hot areas that are pretty wet in particular are really, really good for growing cotton, especially with being supplemented by irrigation, which people in Mesoamerica and South America were doing for a couple thousand years, several thousand years at least. So that's one of the tricky things in terms of looking at the origins of any kind of technology, but especially some type of plant technology, is it's hard to kind of we have these little snapshots and kind of it's a jigsaw puzzle where we're missing most of the pieces. But that is really exciting research that folks are doing. And one way you might get around that in terms of trying to identify the origin spots is maybe through some type of DNA or genetic testing. And I know some researchers are doing some of that type of thing right now.
Great. Okay, Ben, I'm not aware of much use of weaving combs by Pueblo weavers. This is by Ann Headland. I associate combs with later Navajo weaving. What did the Pueblo weavers you traveled and collaborated with have to say about comb usage?
Well, not a whole lot. As far as I understand, Chris, when he's using he uses a belt loom, which is basically a narrow version of a backstrap loom, as far as I understand. I think he doesn't really use one very commonly. And then Louis was pretty excited to show me one that he had bought that was historic. And I know, and this particular one, I mean, I think he has, or I know he has other ones that he uses, but that this one was actually, I have a fork right here. it was actually an old fork that was like bound up in like leather and some other types of fabric, and he was really excited about that one. But that's one avenue that we're pursuing, is talking to more folks to kind of see, you know, is that just, something that was associated with, say, the Navajo loom, or like the horizontal loom, but then was later kind of readapted for these other types of looms, kind of brought backwards. And that's one thing that's, be really interesting to see when we do have these really tight assemblages. So from Keat Seal, or I'm looking at one from Cedar Mesa that is from this really small, well-dated context, or some of the work that Chuck and Lori are doing is trying to reconstruct where these assemblages come from, so we can apply dates to them to see exactly what is that order of operations. Did the combs, were they invented, like I suggested, just for use in those vertical looms, or is that, it's hard to say. It doesn't seem like it's something you have to do, or a tool you have to use, but it does seem like it's specifically developed for a type of loom that has more fixed and larger kind of sets of works. So I don't have a really good answer for you on that one, but like I said, future research is needed.
Okay, we have quite a few questions, so I'm not sure that we'll get to all of them, but let's try a few more. When did weaving begin in the Rio Grande Pueblo area? Where in Southwest are ceramic whorls for spindles found? And what's the timing on the ceramic whorls?
Gosh, that's a really good question. So even in Mesoamerica and in Peru, there's ceramic whorls. And those go back a long, long time. And really, so like Chuck was kind of indicating, it has a lot to do, the type of material you're using has a lot to do with the weight. And so there's a debate, Lori Webster and I talk about this a fair bit, that there's these perforated shirts we get in the Southwest, and there's a debate whether those are actually used for spinning cotton, because we think they're probably too heavy. So cotton, of course, is really, really fragile, right? It's this really fairly short fiber. And so one of the reasons you use these small ceramic whorls that are actually not, it's not like a broken shirt that's been perforated. They're actually those little ones we're showing you, or the horn, or the cottonwood root, is because they're really, really lightweight. And those seem to be kind of most ideally suited for use with cotton spinning. Now, there are, of course, other types of fibers that people use. Bast fibers, like you can get from the Indian hemp, or flax, or nettles, and those things, those types of fibers potentially could be stronger. Or, of course, yucca and agave, right? People say, oh, you can't spin those, you can't use a spindle, but I was just showing my interns last week on how you could. So, it's hard to say exactly that, the order of operations on that, but we do know that ceramic whorls have been used for a long, long time, especially ones that are ideally made or specifically made to be put on spindles. And those, like I said, we find those in Mesoamerica as early as the pre-classic. So that could be a type of technology that's come into the Southwest and then adapted from there.
Okay.
And there's also,
Go ahead, sir.
I came across a paper, I can't remember the title, with perforated ceramic discs being used by native tribes in California as part of what they were calling game strings. Somehow these were used with a cord running through to help carry rabbits from a rabbit hunt. So it's, and like I said, Lori's noted that at least in the Four Corners region, if I'm recalling correctly, she said they've never found, irrefutable proof that the ceramic discs were used with spindle whorls. But then there's this interesting ethnographic report from California. So they may have had multiple uses.
Right. Was there brown and green cotton found prehistorically in the Southwest?
As far as I understand, I don't think green has been found, but I do think there are some examples of natural brown cotton being produced in the Southwest. But primarily we have what is now called the Hopi short staple, and that is really, really well adapted for growing in our especially dry, arid region of the Colorado Plateau. So that, and then there's we call a Pima variety, and those are really the two most common that are used on the Colorado Plateau anyway. And I know that there's a pilot project that Karen Adams is doing right now, and I think she's working with Lori as well, where they're actually taking these modern examples of the Hopi and the Pima cotton and doing some genetic testing and trying to then also sampling some examples from the archaeological record to see if those match up. And so one of the things that I've been experimenting a little bit with sprouting some seeds of some of these different colors of cotton, and I've been reading about some other people trying to do that too, is that the brown and the green are actually kind of a little more finicky. And so it's harder to get them to sprout, and they actually seem to really like kind of the maybe a little bit more humid environments. And so one of the limitations that we might have in the Southwest, and why most of our cotton is white, is because there might be certain genes that are associated with the ability to be more drought tolerant. But it's hard to tell too, because some of these, when you look at these prehistoric textiles, a lot of them are really faded, and or they might have been dyed. The yarns might have been dyed or even painted, and so sometimes it's really hard to tell what the original color was. So there's not really good evidence of it, but I know, like I said, there's some evidence of a brown cotton, but I don't think there's a green.
Okay, Aaron Riggs says, I'm the director of the Utah Valley University Herbarium, and I'm working on floristics in Grand Gulch. Are the battas evidence of cotton growing in Grand Gulch? And do you know which species were there in the Four Corners? Maybe you spoke to the species already, but. Yeah,
like I said, again, I think it's as far as we can tell, it's that Hopi short staple, and but yeah, so that's some of the work I'm doing too, is working, and Lori and I have been talking about a lot, is were they growing cotton in Grand Gulch? And it does seem like they probably were. There's a couple sites where we do have, again, the evidence. We have seeds and some cotton bolls. We know that there's pretty substantial evidence in the Glen Canyon area, before Lake Powell was there. And Grand Gulch does have the type of the slope and some of the soils, nice deep soils, and the subterranean flow, at least it did before over cattle grazing in the 1900s. We think that probably were producing that in Grand Gulch, at least in a few spots anyway. And that's one thing I've been really trying to lock down too, is additional evidence for that, because the sites I looked at from the Pueblo III period, all these little, really small little habitations scattered across the canyons, almost, I don't want to say everyone, but the vast majority do have some evidence of cotton production. So if they weren't growing the cotton there, they were importing a lot from other places like the Kayenta region or Glen Canyon. But that's a really good question.
All right, I think I'm just going to take a couple more. We're pretty much running out of time. An easy one, maybe. What was the largest width loom you found?
Sorry, say again?
The largest width loom that you've seen either?
Oh, the widest. Yeah. So Lynn Teague did a really interesting kind of study of that for her book. What's it called? It's Textiles in Southwestern Prehistory, and she looked at the few intact, or I should say mostly intact cotton blankets that we have, that we assume were made on those large vertical looms. And they tend to be no wider than about a meter a meter and a half or 2 meters. And most of them are probably a little bit smaller than that. And so that is a really good indicator of how big the loom was. You can also look at the distribution of the loom anchors in a floor, like in a set. and there'll be like 4 to 6 or so, let's just say, loom makers in a row, and those are usually slightly larger than the loom itself was. And again, those are no bigger than about 2 meters. So we think they're probably about 1.5 meters at the most in terms of their width. But backstrap looms are much smaller. So they'll be like about yay size to about 40, maybe 50 centimeters at the most, at least in terms of what we've seen, especially in Oaxaca here. You can see this lady in the lower left here. She's a small person, but it's not like they're weaving things that are like 1 meter wide.
Great. We'll just do one more. I understand that in ethnographic modern Pueblan contexts, some weaving was performed in restricted places such as Kivas. Can you speak to the antiquity of that? And was Pill Great House weaving performed in such restricted contexts?
I don't know. Any thoughts on that, Chuck?
Well, I can't answer that one. I mean, in modern Hopi, boy, was the weaving traditionally in the Kivas? I don't know.
Yeah, a lot of it, but then there's also, I mean, I've seen historic photos of people setting up looms out in like a plaza, but from what I understand, it was primarily in Kivas. But the antiquity of that's tricky. Basically, before about 1150 AD, like I said, we have this kind of lack of evidence, and a lot of that is because people lived more on the mesa tops and the open air sites. So the preservation is just much not nearly as good as we have in these alcove sites. So are there loom anchors in Kivas before 1150? It doesn't look like it. I mean, we've excavated enough of those structures that we would probably see rows of loom anchors. And so it does seem about 1100 is when at least that development occurred of the upright loom. But then, of course, with the backstrap loom, you can go anywhere, right? And we showed you guys several examples of these looms rolled up, and then people take them home, they go somewhere else and use them. And so it's really tricky to say what the contexts were of their use. We do know that most of the evidence of cotton textile use and production that we do have, although it's limited, is from these large community centers like great houses. So, we can infer that they were probably produced in those sites, maybe by, like I said, similar to the Mesoamerican example, that maybe it's like the nobles or the elites or however you were leaders, however you want to kind of think about that in public context. Where they were making things for consumption locally, but we don't really know if that was something that was like a prescribed practice that you could only do it in these certain locations. It's just there's not really a good way to lock that down, or at least if there is, I'd love to know about it.
Okay, so I think we're going to have to wrap it up. I do have some questions that are unanswered. I don't know if we can give an email address if someone is really, wanting an answer that they didn't get tonight. But the other thing is, we will have another presentation on the Traditional Technologies Project in November. So if your question didn't get answered this evening, you might have an opportunity to ask it again in November. So I'll talk to Ben and Chuck and see what we want to do with some of these others, but I'll share them with you. So thank you guys. That was totally awesome. Very good presentation. You have some really nice comments in the chat as well, and in the Q&As. So I'll pass those along to you. Thank you, and everyone, thanks for being here, and have a good evening. And we'll see you again next month for Miles Miller. Thanks, you guys. Good night.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Good night. Thanks for watching, guys.